Well, hello and welcome to the second theme within our first module, exploring the spiritual roots of Quaker ways. In the first session, we looked at the overall orientation of the early Quaker movement, the early Quaker vision. What was the nature of that experience, and how was it interpreted, and how did Quakers come to a certain view about what was most important in the spiritual life? In this particular second theme of the first module, we're going to look at how that early vision leads to certain disciplines and practices in terms of worship, in terms of spiritual practice, in terms of discernment and decision making, and in terms of testimony. So it's a general overview linking the early Quaker vision with particular well-established Quaker practices. And so to start with, let's just remember that we saw that vision of a people who felt the Spirit had been poured out on all flesh, that created the possibility of that direct, inward, transformative relationship with God in spirit, and that everything that was most important about the early Quaker way was focused on that sense of inward teaching, inward transformation, and a life lived in that intimate place of relationship. And that being experiential and rather than focused on complex belief. So what kind of spirituality does that create, and how does it result in certain common practices that we can see across Quaker history? Well, first of all, the overall shape of Quaker spirituality, we can say, is a spirituality that's focused on listening and waiting, a contemplative practice in stillness and silence. And of course, that relates to the early Quaker understanding that spiritual transformation does not come through great human effort, but through human surrender of the human will, so that God's will can live through us. And that leads to a spirituality of listening and waiting. And because in our experience, Quakers have found that when they give up, when they surrender their own will, when they allow themselves to be open to divine guidance, they will indeed receive that transformative experience. They will be guided and they will be transformed. So a spirituality of guidance and transformation. Any tradition that's based on the immediate teachings of the Spirit within them has to have a discipline that tests what that inward teaching is telling them to do. And in the Quaker tradition, we tend to call that discernment. So a careful interrogation of what our inward leadings are, where are they coming from, what are they leading to? Is this the divine Spirit living through us and working through us, or are our motivations coming from somewhere else? So it's an interrogation of emotions and motivations. It's a testing of the rightness of our leadings. So a spirituality of discernment and testing. And then finally, of course, a lived faith that's put into action. The experience of inward guidance, when it's properly tested, is outwardly visible in a transformed life and tends to be associated with a commitment to building a better world. So a spirituality of new life, which is put into action. We're going to start then by looking at the distinctive manner of Quaker worship in the unprogrammed tradition. How did that emerge? Well, one story about how it emerges is that in the 17th century, there were groups of people who became known as seekers. And seekers tended to be people who'd been born in the local parish church of the Anglican Church, who'd maybe left that church and gone into an independent congregation, which we sometimes today call Reformed, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and so on. They may have left that church and become Baptists for a while, and they may have tried a variety of other groups that were available in the early parts of the 17th century and into the English Revolution. But the story goes that lots of people ended up dissatisfied with all the options that were on offer, and in desperation and despondency, in a sense, started meeting together in silence, waiting for a revelation from God. And of course, George Fox's story about the gathering of the Quaker movement in Westmoreland in 1652 essentially talks about how he was able to bring people to an understanding that there was that of Christ Jesus within them that could speak to thy condition, that there was a real living spiritual power that could be found within them that could teach and transform them. And so a waiting in silence that started off in desperation and despondency suddenly became a waiting in silence of excited expectancy that something was going to happen, because there is a real powerful spirit available to us. And that's where we kind of get this idea that our waiting worship in the unprogrammed tradition is expectant waiting. We wait quietly to see what the Spirit will do, but we do so with a certain hopeful expectation that we will experience something important. In terms of early Quaker worship, it was understood in a very particular way, which I hope you can see is linked to the early Quaker vision we talked about earlier. This sense of the real presence of Christ in spirit within people, and an understanding that Christ is the eternal high priest. Now, if that's the situation, early friends said, Christ will order the worship. There will be no human ordering of the worship, because there is the only legitimate form of worship is where the divine in spirit orders the worship. And that's the basis of unprogrammed worship, allowing the spirit, the divine spirit, to move amongst the people, the gathered people, to do its work, to reveal things to them, to lead them to something new. And so that's another way of considering the development of an unprogrammed form of worship in silence and stillness. It's allowing God to order the worship and to transform us. And this kind of sense of inward, the internalization and spiritualization of some of the things that we see outwardly in other churches is quite important for early friends. And so instead of a baptism in water, early friends expected a baptism in the Holy Spirit within them. Instead of sharing in the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion as an outward act of taking bread and wine, there was an expectation that you would feed inwardly on the bread and wine of the true vine, the bread of life and the wine of the true vine, as an inward and spiritual experience. And the aspects of the liturgical calendar of other churches was also internalized and spiritualized. And so you might say that Quaker worship is a little bit like Advent. It's a process of waiting for Christ to be born. For Quakers, that was an inward birth in the spirit rather than remembering an outward birth in history primarily. Holy Saturday, the period between the crucifixion on Good Friday and the resurrection on Easter Sunday, again, an interesting inward metaphor for the style of worship that allows us to wait for something to happen. If in Advent we're waiting for Christ to be born within us, on Holy Saturday we're waiting for the resurrection of Christ within us in spirit. That's the ways in which early friends understood what was going on within them by relating it to the outward stories of the Jesus event. Often people have a bit of a concern about the word worship. It's discomforting for many people. And I think it's helpful to look at the etymology of the word. In the West Saxon root, it means the condition of being worthy. So we might say that what we should be doing in worship is giving our undivided attention to that which is most important and most worthy, focusing on what really matters rather than on less important and trivial matters. So worship is about giving attention to something. And there are a number of metaphors for the style of worship that Quakers have adopted. And first of all, we're going to look at the first two metaphors are attending and waiting on the Lord. In terms of attending, the American Quaker Marjorie Post Abbott has said that there is kind of two meanings to the word attending, and we're doing both of them in our meeting for worship. First of all, we're attending in the sense that we've made the effort to turn up and be together with others gathered together, to focus on what's most important, as we've just said. But there is a second meaning to attending, which is to pay attention to pay careful attention to attend to that which is most important, that which is most worthy. And in meeting for worship, we're doing both of those things. We're turning up and we're paying attention to what is most important. The second metaphor is waiting on the Lord, which has obviously got a biblical basis to it. And what the metaphor is working with there is the idea that we are a bit like servants around a table at which a king is feasting. And when you're a servant, you have to stand with very careful attention to what's going on in case you are called to do something. And so the sense of waiting on the Lord, and this is a metaphor that shouldn't be taken too literally, but it gives that sense of us waiting very attentively and sensing what's going on and listening for the call to do something, listening for the leading to ministry. And that's this sense of waiting on the Lord as a metaphor for Quaker worship. I also use this metaphor of us being like a gathered orchestra playing together. And so in Quaker worship is inevitably a collective experience. It depends on the contribution of all its members. And I suppose there's an interesting question: are we the players or are we the instruments? And what is being played through us in meeting for worship? Who's conducting the process? Who wrote the music? These are all metaphors that can be pushed too far. But in terms of this idea that we are allowing ourselves to be open to divine guidance, we're in a sense allowing ourselves to be available for the Spirit to play music on us. Sometimes the vocal ministry in worship has been likened to us being a flute on which the Holy Spirit plays. And so that raises some questions about how important it is to practice our instruments. If we are to play a part in this gathered orchestra, this gathered sacred music of worship, what does it require us to do in terms of practicing our instrument? And of course, that will lead us on to some questions about personal spiritual practices. But if you've ever been part of a musical group, you'll know that sometimes the music can be a bit staccato, can be a bit kind of out of sync or whatever. But other times, the music almost seems to have a life of itself. The orchestra becomes more than a sum of its parts. The music flows through us in a way that seems to come from somewhere else. And I think the gathered worship at its best is an experience a bit like that. Of course, it may not be as ordered as a conducted orchestra that we're seeing here. And so we might also ask ourselves, is Quaker worship a bit more like improvisation or jazz? What's important here, I think, though, is that in order for improvisation to work, the musician's understanding of musical structure and their instrument needs to be sufficiently well developed that they can allow that improvisation to happen through them in a kind of an organic way. And so again, there's some interesting questions about what sort of spiritual practices we need to have individually so that when we come together in meeting for worship, we can most easily be the instrument through which the Spirit can work, through which the Spirit can play music in an improvised and expectant kind of way. We've already referred a little bit to vocal ministry, but as I've said, the flute, we are the flute on which the Spirit plays. We talked about the prophetic in our first session. Vocal ministry is meant to be prophetic in the sense that we make ourselves available so that the Spirit of God can speak through us, can communicate something important through us. And at its best, if it's well discerned, good vocal ministry will deepen the worship experience so that when we speak, we improve the silence rather than breaking the silence. And at its best, vocal ministry nurtures the spiritual development of all of those who hear it. But it is a prophetic vocation. The idea is that it's not us speaking in our own will, but it is the divine will speaking through us. The message passes through us. We allow it to happen. We're back to that idea of surrendering again. And sometimes it's said that the water tastes of the pipes. And what I mean by that is, although this is meant to be the divine spirit speaking through us, we are real situated people in a particular place, in a particular time, with particular language and all the rest of it. And so although the message comes from beyond us, it passes through us and is inevitably shaped by who we are. The water tastes of the pipes that it passes through. And so we will we are likely to give vocal ministry in the language that's our first language. Things like that. We're likely to express ourselves in a way that's culturally appropriate to the place that we find ourselves in. And so I think we've already alluded to the significance of spiritual practices here. If Quaker spirituality is based on that sense of surrender and expectant waiting, what kinds of spiritual practices help us more easily to be still, to be attentive, and to be receptive? If our spirituality gives a high place to careful discernment of our leadings, what do we need to do to become more aware of our emotions and where they rise from, and be able to test them in a kind of a sensitive and self-aware way? And finally, given that our spirituality is focused on a transformed life, a visible witness in the world, what spiritual practices help us to have the resolve to be faithful to do what we're called to do, particularly when actually sometimes our callings can be very challenging, and we may find resistance around us in the world to the things that we're called to do. Where do we find that spiritual ballast and sense of empowerment that allows us to do things that maybe we couldn't do purely in our own power? And our spiritual practices may help us to kind of flex those spiritual muscles and allow us to be better able to be still and attentive, more adept at testing our leadings and our motivations in terms of discernment, and more robust in our ability to confidently live that new way in the world. So our spiritual practices require patience. That's somewhat counter-cultural in a society that's based on instant gratification, but sometimes it's more important sticking at a practice and being with it and allowing it to do its work over time than worrying about immediate kind of results. So we need patience. It's a long-term commitment. In a very busy world, we need to think about whether we should set times of retirement aside, so times when we step back from the busyness of life and consciously create the space in which we can be more open to the Spirit. And for some of us, our spiritual experiences might just be a gentle nudge over time, an evolutionary change, a sense of ongoing low-level guidance. But of course, for some people, there is that sort of significant one-off major spiritual transformation experience that we might call the consuming fire, and sometimes a mixture of the two. And one's not better than the other. It's just different experiences for different people in different times. So let's move on to discernment. Why is discernment so important for Quakers? Well, as I've said, any community like Quakers that places direct spiritual guidance at the heart of its faith and practice must take discernment seriously. We need to interrogate our inner motivations. Where are they coming from? Is it coming from a good place or a not so good place? Is this the leadings of the Spirit, or is this our own ego? It's those sorts of questions that we need to be asking ourselves, distinguishing between true and false leadings. And of course, this is a practice that we need to exercise both as individuals and as a community. So it's an individual and a corporate discipline. The American Quaker Michael Burkle has quite an interesting set of metaphors for discernment. And he says one is about looking forward and one is about looking back. So the metaphor for looking forward is about sorting laundry. When we have laundry to sort, we can organise our laundry in all sorts of ways. You might organise it by what year you bought the clothes in, or what shop you bought them from, and various other things. But actually, if you order them in the wrong way, there can be all sorts of implications. So if you mix your colours and your whites all together, then that can have particular implications. And so the metaphor here is about thinking about, where is the leading going to? What are the implications of this leading? Interrogating our motivations as a looking forward practice. The other side of it is there's a looking back practice. And Burkle talks about the metaphor of unraveling thread. So if the cat has got into your sewing and into your yarn and so on, and mixed it all up, and you have the job of untangling it all, that's something like the practice of discernment as a looking back. What you're doing is you're scrutinizing where your motivations are coming from. You're following particular lines of thread, seeing where they're going. And sometimes they can be going somewhere quite different than where you think they are. So in a scrabbled mass of yarn that we can see in the picture there, you think you're going in one direction, but if you follow the thread, it can go in all sorts of twisty and turny ways that you weren't expecting. And taking time to scrutinize where a motivation's coming from can be really helpful, because sometimes we're motivated by things at a deeply subconscious level, and we're driven by urges that are only partially familiar to us. And so taking the time to consider those things, that unraveling thread, that looking back at where things are coming from, can help us to be very clear about the nature of our leadings and our motivations. And of course, discernment is therefore important for Quakers in all sorts of things. It's important when we make personal decisions in our lives. It's important within worship. What are the leadings coming up in worship? What about the leadings to speak in vocal ministry? There are community decisions that have to be taken within this discipline. The discernment of gifts within the community is an important and often neglected aspect of the discipline of discernment. Sometimes it's other people who can genuinely see your true gifts, and they need to be helping you to discern them and become aware of them so that you can use them for the benefit of the community. And that's, of course, the basis of our nominations practice, making sure that the people who are asked to do particular roles are the ones who have the appropriate gifts to do them. All of these things are about taking seriously that discipline of scrutiny about motivations and gifts and emotions, and where we're being led and where those things come from. Finally, Quaker testimony, the way in which those inward experiences properly discerned are then revealed in the outward world, in our outward lives. So testimony is an outward physical side of our inward sign of our inward spiritual experiences. Fruits of the Spirit, we might say, breaking into the particularities of our lives. Our testimony, the way we live our lives, the way our lives preach or speak, communicates something about the truth that we've found revealed within us. Rachel Muir's English Quaker academic has written a very interesting book on the nature of Quaker testimony. And one of the things that Rachel says is that historically Quaker testimony has had both a negative dimension and a positive dimension. On the negative side, Quaker testimony has tended to be an interruption of and a refusal to go along with certain ways of the world as it currently is. So she says that Quaker testimony in this sense can be a sustained, enacted opposition to some power or structure of thought that claims to shape and uphold the world, but in fact destroys it. A process of doing the truth as opposed and opposing the lies that conceal the complex reality of the world as it is. So this negative form of testimony is a kind of a double negative. It's a denial of a lie. It's an unwillingness to go along with things simply because they're the common practice, where the Spirit is telling us that these things are wrong, that these things are disruptive. And we're called to interrupt those practices and to refuse to go along with them. On the positive side, of course, if you refuse to do something and if you interrupt the normal way of doing things, it's incumbent on you to show a different way. And so the positive side of Quaker testimony is the opening up of new possibilities. So having refused to go along with something, what's the alternative? And Rachel calls these holy experiments based on Penn's example in Pennsylvania. Interrupting established patterns and assumptions makes space for alternative possibilities to emerge. A testimony against something leads to actions that express the hope for positive change. So, for example, in the 1960s, when Quakers published a book called A Quaker View of Sex, they were beginning to interrupt and refuse the dominant understandings of what was normal sexuality and what wasn't. And in doing so, opened up the possibility of reconsidering those things and coming to different conclusions. Our concern about the destructive relationship of humanity to the natural world, we are called to refuse to go along with those assumptions, the assumption that humans can do whatever they like with the rest of the natural world. But in doing that, we've got to find alternative ways of living. This is this mixture of negative aspects of testimony and positive aspects of testimony. And by its nature, testimony communicates something. It seeks to change by persuasion rather than by coercion. So it's what Rachel calls a non-violent, self-involving form of communication that wins by persuasion. It seeks to provoke and prompt a response in people, get them to question things that they take for granted, presents itself to the world and calls for a response. But when you do that, of course, it's risky and uncertain. You may prompt very vigorous opposition, sometimes violence. People may misunderstand you. They may deliberately misunderstand you. You might get yourself in all sorts of difficulties and trouble. And you might, because you have to live adventurously and you have to do the best you can and you have to do the discernment you can, but ultimately you have to accept that you might get things wrong. And so testimony is both a refusal, an opening up of new possibilities, something that communicates something to people, but also something that may well provoke negative responses and make your life quite difficult. And so that's the kind of the more challenging aspects of being willing to be seen to be different and rejecting the way things normally are and opening up new possibilities. And some of the questions we might want to think about that relate to all of those practices are, for you personally, are what are the joys and challenges of Quaker worship in your experience? Can you think of a time when vocal ministry has had a significant impact for you? What spiritual practices have you tried and what works for you and what doesn't work for you? In what ways has Quaker discernment practice and your use of it changed the way you make your own personal decisions? And what joys and challenges have you experienced in trying to let your life speak? So I hope you found that useful. Please, you can watch this over and over again, focus on the questions, have a think about this individually, and you may well want to meet together to consider it before we have our live webinar. So that's the end of this section, friends.